Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. From British naval patrols through the South China Sea to South Korean intelligence sharing information about North Korea's participation in the war in Ukraine, America's allies are cooperating in a growing variety of domains. In their recent foreign affairs piece, Julie Smith and Lindsey argue that the United States should support and facilitate cooperation among America's European and Indo-Pacific allies. In a world where U.S. adversaries are deepening their cooperation in an axis of upheaval, it is no longer sufficient to ask allies to just focus on their own respective geographic corners of the world. From defense industrial cooperation to cross-domain situational awareness, Smith and Ford argue that cooperation between American allies stands to benefit American grand strategy. If the U.S. fails to capitalize on the already present trend of growing cooperation, Washington risks self-isolation and an inability to effectively manage the challenges in a world where the lines between Asia and Europe are blurring and crises on one continent have spillover effects in the other. So to discuss their piece and much, much more, we're very welcome to have Julie Smith and Lindsey with us on Brussels Sprouts today. Julie, Lindsey, welcome.
Thanks so much.
Quick introductions. Julie Smith is president and co-founder of Clarion Strategies. She was U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO from 2021 to 2024. And Lindsey is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. She was Senior Director for South Asia at the National Security Council from 2024 to 2025 and U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia from 2021 to 2024. All right. Well, one of the key points, as I said in my intro, that you all make in your piece is that the lines between Asia and Europe are blurring. And so I really want to start there. And Julie, maybe with you. You were ambassador to NATO at the start of the war in Ukraine. 6 months into the war, we see the Iranian drones showing up on the battlefields. North Korea sends its ammunition. And in relatively short order, it becomes clear that China's sending the component parts and has really become a key lifeline for Russia in its war. Talk to us a little bit about what that picture, it's clear in hindsight now, but it wasn't so clear when you're in the moment. And I just have been wanting to ask you for such a long time, what that picture looked like sitting at NATO headquarters. How ready and willing were European allies in particular to accept this growing cooperation and to share the U.S. assessment about the extent of cooperation between Russia and its backers?
Well, the Biden administration came into office with the idea that finding opportunities to move our European allies closer to our Indo-Pacific allies would ultimately benefit all of us, benefit the United States, and benefit the web of allies that we have across the Atlantic and the Pacific. But putting that into practice was, in some cases, more challenging inside the NATO alliance. Obviously, early on in the Biden administration, you had perhaps the best example of an initiative in that regard, and that was AUKUS, which tried to link the defense communities between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and is still in existence, although under review today. But at NATO, it was more challenging. We were first and foremost, starting in late 2021 into early 2022, focused on the war in Ukraine. And that became all-consuming. And it didn't leave a lot of space for us to find opportunities to work with NATO's Indo-Pacific partners. The alliance already had a formal relationship with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, but it wasn't obvious to us until the war got underway, and we saw how those countries immediately jumped into action, how we could use Ukraine as a launch pad to deepen the alliance's relationship with those four countries in the Indo-Pacific. And then, as you note, over time, we slowly started to weave together a narrative, but it wasn't clear in the beginning what was happening. China's provision of dual use components, machine tools, microelectronics, nitrocellulose, uh, Iran's provision of drones, missiles, and then North Korea showing up on the battlefield. That then eventually became one picture of this kind of movement for these four countries: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. It was a microcosm of this new chapter in their cooperation. We had an announcement in February of 2022 about a no limits partnership between Russia and China. And then we saw them quickly pursue these partnerships elsewhere. So it did evolve over time. I can't say that when I arrived at NATO in late 2021 that I was focused on this framing as it related to Ukraine, because we anticipated the war was coming, but it hadn't started yet. And of course, we couldn't have predicted how those nations would come together to assist Russia. But it is an important case study. And I think what Lindsey and I are trying to do with this piece is to warn folks that this type of cooperation is something that we'll see more of in the future.
Lindsey, I'm going to come to you for the view from the Indo-Pacific allies. Kind of, I'm really curious about what you were hearing from allies in the region. But really quickly, one follow-up question, Julie. You mentioned kind of when you went to NATO, you already kind of had this idea, this mandate that you wanted to build greater interlinkages between the allies. That's something that even predated the war, which only increased the urgency with which we should pursue that strategy. But what was driving that idea initially in the earliest days of the Biden administration to want to draw together more closely the Indo-Pacific and European allies? What was the kind of motivating force behind that push?
Well, I think it was multiple things that kind of came together. I mean, first and foremost, then President-elect Biden, during the transition, had spent a lot of time focused on rebuilding and revitalizing America's alliances around the world. But it wasn't just about returning to the status quo, how we valued them and modernized them before President Trump's first term. It was about innovation and trying to find ways to develop new linkages, in part because that deepening Russia and Chinese relationship, even before the announcement of their no limits partnership, was already something that many of us were closely watching. And they were starting to show up in different places around the world, either physically in terms of exercises and training, or operating together, or we would see them kind of parroting each other's narrative when it came to disinformation. They both put out the same COVID-19 conspiracies. So I think what I can say is that President Biden, before he even came into office, I had worked on the transition, and we had talked a lot about how to cope with this evolving and deepening relationship between Russia and China. And one way to do that would be to break down the silos. I mean, normally America's Atlantic allies are off in one corner, and America's Pacific allies are off in another.
Lindsey, okay, so then we get already the early seeds of this cooperation, particularly between Russia and China, as Julie said. But then you get the full scale invasion, and it really is a critical catalyst for the cooperation amongst these four US adversaries. And certainly, Indo-Pacific allies were incredibly attuned to what was happening in the war in Ukraine, and I know very concerned about what was happening there. But talk to us. So, from your perch in the Pentagon, you were hearing from our kind of Southeast Asian allies all the time. What were their observations? What were their concerns about the war in Ukraine, and B, the way they saw China and North Korea's participation in particular?
Sure. I think there were, a couple of things. One, and we mentioned this in the piece, I think it became pretty clear to a lot of Asian allies as they were watching what happened in Ukraine. Hey, look, what's going on in Europe today could definitely happen in Asia tomorrow. And it matters that we say something about it, and it matters that we respond in a way that demonstrates that territorial sovereignty can't just be violated with no costs. Um, and I think we talk in the piece about things that you saw Asian allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia do to respond to the situation. But we also saw things like, unprecedented statements coming out of countries like Singapore because they said, hey, look, we are a small country with a very large neighbor. And if the idea that big countries can just gobble up their neighbors without repercussions stands, that's an existential problem for us. And so I think there was a lot of recognition of that. I think what was also important, though, that I saw at the Pentagon and the Biden administration went the other way as well. So we were experiencing a whole lot of problems, harassment militarily and economically, countries like the Philippines, of Taiwan. And that's something that I think historically had maybe been seen as an Asian problem. But what we began to see, and folks were encouraging, was for European partners to think about the role that they could play in providing support as well. So the US Navy has made transits through the Taiwan Strait, has, been emphasizing how we fly and sail and operate anywhere that US, that international law allows. What I think is important is that's not just a thing that the United States does, but increasingly, as European partners decided that they were going to deploy to the Indo-Pacific, they started deploying in a way that demonstrated the international rights that were afforded. And that's a really important signal to China that the international community stands behind these kinds of principles. And for Taiwan or for the Philippines, that if China decides the next time, hey, sorry, we might just leave those bananas rotting on the docks again. It's a nice little country you have. It's a real shame if anything happened to it. That European partners and other countries will actually step in and look for ways to provide economic support and to shore up supply chains. And so it wasn't just military support, but we were also really thinking about, from a supply chain and an economic perspective, how Europe could provide support in Asia.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for that, and Julie for your comments too, and welcome to the show. It's great to see you both and to talk about this. Yeah, the ideas that you all were talking about, or this concept of the blurring lines between Asia and Europe, and the need to get closer. I'll give Toria Nuland a tip of the hat, because right after 9/11, she started talking about a global NATO, and that's when we began to talk to the Australians, the Japanese, South Koreans, and others, and began to build that relationship that really helped us in Afghanistan. Some deployed there, Australia particularly. I think Japan deployed on the counter piracy, helped us for the first time. They kind of left the Japanese waters and began to help out. I think it was Japan, but anyway, I'm glad that y'all are continuing to ring that bell so people remember that this has got a good track record to it that's been helpful. And you all coming online and saying we got to keep it up, I think is important. One of the big debates, and it kind of goes up and down. It's kind of gotten quiet recently, but Lindsay, it goes to something you were talking about in terms of European assistance, both militarily but also politically. That the old policy point that we all know, which is we got to show a bad guy that there's lots of flags out there that are reacting. It's not just the U.S. That's an important thing, and you mentioned that, and having Japan and others come online to show China and Russia that it's not just against the U.S. You're up against the rest of the world. That's a good point. But one of the debates on this is, well, how far do you take that in terms of military deployments? There are some people, and I guess this is more a comment, Andrea, than it is a question, but I have a question at the end. This is,
We're waiting for it, Jim.
it's coming. It's coming. There's a lot of people who probably don't quite understand the military wherewithal of our allies and feel that allies should be deploying both to the Indo-Pacific as well as fighting the Russians on the European plains. And of course, it's not enough to do that. But there still is an idea that they need to be out there in more than just on a staff at Indo-Pacific or RIMPAC or something like that. It's got to be more than just a staff presence. That they need to do more in terms of ships. The Brits, of course, have had rotations out there. The Germans managed to pull one off. The French have a pretty much a long-term presence out there because of their holdings. But where are you in terms of your article? Are you all saying, look, things are getting very tense in Europe, but even so, we've got to get allies militarily out in case of an Indo-Pacific contingency? They need to be out there on the front lines helping us fight. Or are you coming down on the other side that says, look, you guys, European allies, you take care of Russia. We're going to have to focus on the Indo-Pacific. That might mean pulling forces out of Europe. We all know those discussions. But where are you all in terms of your thinking about what does a European deployment or a European participation in things in the Indo-Pacific? What does it look like militarily?
Well, maybe I'll jump in and start and then hand it over to Lindsey. So two things that I want to say on this. First of all, on the global NATO and NATO's desire to have deeper relationships with those four countries in the Indo-Pacific, I just want to make clear to the listeners that no one is suggesting that NATO add these countries in the Indo-Pacific as members. There is not a push by the countries in the Indo-Pacific or by the Secretary General or by NATO members to go global, to make this a global alliance. It is a Euro-Atlantic alliance, and it will stay that way. However, I think increasingly, even our friends in France, who initially had some real questions about the utility of NATO's relationship with these, we call them the IP4, the Indo-Pacific Four, even the French are kind of changing their tune and see the value here. So that's point number one. And I think we'll continue to see that trend line, even with a US administration that seems to have some reservations. And that brings me to my next point. I think what the current US administration, the current Trump administration, is really questioning is at a time, as you noted, Jim, when Europe needs to be focused on Ukraine, on the Russian threat. Is it important for European countries, not through NATO, but as individual nations, to be present and develop these relationships in the Indo-Pacific? I think where Lindsey and I land, I know where Lindsey and I land, is that we still see great utility in Europe working with countries in the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. And in fact, they're moving on irrespective of where the current Trump administration lands on this. From some reporting, we see indications that the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby, supposedly messaged his UK counterpart that the UK would be better served by keeping its naval forces and assets in the Atlantic region and not sending them off into the South China Sea or the Indo-Pacific region. We'll know more once the National Defense Strategy drops and once the National Security Strategy drops, but I suspect where they're headed, there's been a lot of people writing on this, is they're more comfortable with kind of this regional approach. Russia and Europe cover down on their region one way or another. I mean, Russia obviously has a very troubling vision for how it wants to deal with Europe and operate with Europe. And then China will be the bigger player in the Indo-Pacific and kind of, quote, handle it is kind of the approach by some, I think, in the administration, or we'll just leave that region to its own devices. And then the US will focus more heavily on the Western Hem. Now, that's the cartoon version, and there's a lot more nuance to it. So I'm being a bit unfair, but I think commentators on the right and left suspect that that's kind of the current approach of the Trump administration. Lindsey and I disagree with that. We see tremendous value, enormous value in bringing our Indo-Pacific and our European allies closer together on economic issues, tech issues, development assistance, defense production, you name it. But we are not suggesting that every nation in Europe send its naval forces into the South China Sea. I mean, we have to think about trade-offs here, and also what these navies are actually capable of doing, which in some cases they just don't have the global reach. But I think in instances where the UK, France, the Netherlands, and Germans have taken it upon themselves to be present in the Indo-Pacific, we do find those deployments valuable. So that's my 2 cents on that. But over to Lindsey.
But just to interject, I thought a comment made by the Australian foreign minister when the idea of a relationship between Australia and NATO. This was back again Tory Newland days. When she was asked, I think it was a she, when she was asked, well, what do you think about Australia joining NATO? She shook her head and said, "No way, those meetings last too long. I'm not going to fly all the way over there and sit through long NATO meetings." And so that kind of ended it for Australia.
Already hard at 32. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just to add on what Julie said, I think sometimes the sort of conversation about, should allies across Europe and Asia be working more closely together, it gets painted really narrowly, in a way that loses a lot of nuance, right? It almost gets painted as, well, suddenly the UK and France are going to be like, well, forget about European security. We're just going all in on Asia deployments. And I think, that's sort of a cartoonish version of what I don't think anybody ever thinks would really happen. And I think Julie and I would both argue, like, fundamentally, yes, I absolutely want Asian partners to prioritize what they need to do for their own self-defense, the force structure, the spending that they need for Asia Pacific deterrence and scenarios. And of course, you want Europe to do the same. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing and there is no value to be gained in having them work more closely together. So, we talk in the piece about at a moment in which US carriers are suddenly going to Southcom for the first time, is there value in intermittent European deployments for, say, countries like the Philippines, who are taking it on the chin in the South China Sea all the time? I would argue yes. At a moment in which we're seeing China and Russia work together, exercise and train together across a much wider expanse, and in more sophisticated ways, why would we not want US allies to be training and exercising together like that as well? Because heaven forbid you ever have a conflict, you're going to want your allies to have actually had some practice training and operating together. And so discouraging from that actually disadvantages us. And I think, as we saw, in the Ukraine situation, from a defense industrial base perspective, if you actually have a conflict, the notion that just the sort of immediate territorial neighbors are gonna be enough to help that country that's under attack just doesn't stand up to reality. You're gonna need partners from other regions playing a role. And God knows, China would be a much more formidable adversary in the event of a conflict than Russia. So having our allies think about DIB cooperation together is absolutely something we should be encouraging. And so I think it's a signaling thing too, that the United States should be saying this actually does matter. And we can still prioritize, but we ought to be thinking more creatively about these linkages.
I would just build on that also to note that it doesn't have to be necessarily instances or examples of folks in Asia traveling to Europe for some concrete new initiative, operating, exercise, training together, although some of that is happening, as Lindsey noted, or European ships showing up in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, in some cases, it's literally about getting these countries together on a Zoom call and sharing best practices. At NATO, we had several sessions where we saw, say, South Korea launch a new cybersecurity strategy, and they'd dial into the NATO alliance, and all the ambassadors would sit around the table and get briefed by the South Koreans on how are you coping with cybersecurity attacks stemming from the PRC. And then we would take those lessons to heart, and then a hand would go up, and Estonia would say, well, that's interesting because we're battling the same thing right now, but from the Russians. And so let's put these two experiences together. Oh, looks like they're sharing the same tactics. They have the same overarching strategy. How can we fortify ourselves individually as nations, but learn from each other's experiences? And the more that we did that inside the alliance, the more we realized the similarities between how the Chinese are relying on gray zone tactics and how the Russians are relying on gray zone tactics. And there's tremendous amount of overlap. So we felt stronger when it was literally just down to a Zoom call, not necessarily someone physically even traveling across the Atlantic or the Pacific. But I will say that those sessions were some of the most fascinating. There were literally, I felt like you could see light bulbs going off above people's heads as the sessions were taking place. And we really treasured those sessions because it highlighted the unique insights and advantages that each set of allies had in their respective regions and what we all could learn from that.
Yeah, the sharing of best practices, I mean, like those types of things, you really do hope that they're continuing. Although I think right at this point, it's hard to tell. Obviously, the IP4 didn't participate in the last summit in the same way. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on behind closed doors. So I think those things like sharing of best practices, those are not low hanging fruit because you don't want to minimize the importance of it. It's really important. But kind of going back to Jim's question, and we keep kind of like pushing on this in part because we had just done this study on the, Russian opportunistic aggression if the United States is involved in a crisis in the Indo-Pacific. And in that situation, there certainly are going to be all sorts of gaps and vulnerabilities. And so it raises the question on, would European allies have the capacity, for example, in that moment to be supportive in defense industrial production? Or would they need to be very careful about what they were supplying because they would have to be ready and maintain a credible deterrent against Russia? And it's not a well-formulated question, but it's trying to, like, if push really comes to shove, what do we really want our allies to be doing in Asia? I think that's a question for me. And it's also a question that we got a lot from European colleagues while we were working on this Russian opportunistic question. Do you think our European allies have a clear picture of what US expectations would be if things heat up in the Indo-Pacific?
I guess what I would say is this, the evolving relationship between China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, sort of, which you guys have written about in all of, your stuff on this axis of upheaval. Fundamentally, I think the question there is, what are the implications of that cooperation for what a conflict could look like, where it might play out, how long it might last, how much strain we would face on the industrial base. And the reality is, like, that scenario is evolving quickly. And so I think ultimately, and we kind of talk about this in the piece, what you really need to see, and kudos to CNAS for leading the charge on this, I think, is evolving thinking about how adversarial cooperation changes what warfare and what conflict could look like. And then from that, I think you answer the question about what could allies do and where would they need to do it. But I would just argue that I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to go into how this adversarial cooperation is really changing what we're all looking at over the next 5 to 10 years.
I think that's exactly right. And what we try to really get across with this piece in foreign affairs is that we collectively, we working with our allies, shouldn't make the assumption that we will face a singular incident in one region. I mean, throughout the piece, we repeatedly stress that now, with this partnership, this kind of strategic alignment between Russia and China with these other countries, the prospect of a multi theater conflict in multiple domains is very real. And we have to ready ourselves and ready our allies to face challenges in other regions. So, I mean, let's say something starts to unravel around Taiwan. We have to talk to our European allies not only about what that means for them and their security and US force posture and lots of associated questions, but ready Europe to also think through the scenarios in which Russia may want to pose a dilemma in their AOR, so to speak. They view it as their kind of sphere of influence, and Russia may want to cause trouble and stir things up and suddenly fly more drones into NATO airspace or more incursions with Russian jets into NATO airspace, or who knows what. I mean,
Course.
they always have a new play up their sleeve. And so we have to talk to our allies about this framing because your question was how ready are the European allies? And I mean, it varies obviously depending on who you're talking to. And some countries are all in on this framing and they accept it and they want to talk about it and they believe in strengthening these partnerships and readying themselves for these possibilities. Others are left or stuck in an older framing and really aren't prepared for some of these dilemmas. They're not thinking through what could happen to them and their own security and economic prosperity if Taiwan gets, completely overtaken or attacked by China. So we're making progress in this regard, but there's a lot more work to be done. And the challenge here is, will the current US administration help lead the way in these discussions? Or will it just kind of leave everybody to their respective regional silos and not help prepare us for this very real possibility of multi theater conflict across multiple domains?
If I could jump in, just to clarify the point that I think we're trying to make. I think y'all are absolutely right in terms of the framing, the new framing, the importance of engagement by European nations with this issue of both Asia and of a collaboration between Russia and China and just what you described. I think is we definitely agree with that. That's something that this administration is missing out on. But I think it's really, at least I'll speak for myself. I think as we've done our work, and as I saw when I was at NATO for so long, um, it's no matter the framing of the European country, no matter how willing and how urgent they might want to take part in something there in Asia. We're just talking about the mere military capability on hand to do something, at least for the next 10 years. 20 years from now, maybe 30 years from now, they'll have enough to be able to do both. But right now, if you just take the UK, who are very, very happy to take part in things in Asia with the AUKUS, we see that. But this is during wartime or the run up to wartime. If they were to provide a carrier task force, one of the new big carriers and the very few surface vessels that they really have that can go along with it, and all the problems they have with refueling it and all these things that come with that kind of deployment with a big carrier like that, They could not have that. They could not deal with an ops tempo of having a carrier in the Indo-Pacific, dealing with an unwinding in the Taiwan, as well as helping us deter in Europe too with that with their second carrier. They can't do both, and that's one of the major military powers there. The French have determined the same thing about themselves, and so for us at least, and again, I'll let Andrea speak for herself, but my whole point is that until they have more stuff, more personnel, et cetera, when the balloon goes up, they're gonna have to just focus on Europe, to my mind. And I don't like that. I want them to be able to just swing both ways, but right now they're not able to. During peacetime, like today, I want them, like you guys were saying, Lindsay, I want them to be over working with the Philippine, and I want them to have Zooms and all of those things. That's a lot of goodness there. But I think for us and from our studies and discussions and personal experience, they don't have it right now to do both. They've really got to focus their industrial capacity, all the things that they're doing. Got to be focused on a European contingency, not just Ukraine, but what Russia might do in the next few years.
Yeah.
Andrea,
Oh, sorry. I mean, 100%, 100%. There are limits. There are very real limits, and there could be limits for the next 50 years. I mean,
yeah,
I don't think Lindsay and I wanted to suggest with this piece, we were by no means trying to stress that suddenly Europeans have to take a more active role in the military security of our Indo-Pacific allies. I think instead we were saying we do see some value in these deployments in peacetime. I think it's important for us to walk through contingencies of how Russia and China could challenge all of us together.
right,
It's important for us collectively in Asia, in North America, and in Europe to focus on defense production and do it together
right,
in a thoughtful way and meet the same kind of standards and pursue this in a coordinated fashion, and to share those best practices, and to think about setting norms and first principles for tech. That is the new strategic arena when it comes to dealing with China in particular. So yes, there are loads of areas where we could do more. There are areas where Europe and the Indo-Pacific are off doing their own thing. I mean, the Japanese are talking to the Italians and the Brits about developing a sixth generation fighter. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting things happening, but
right.
by no means are we here to sit here with you guys today and tell your listeners that the future for Europe is for all of them to have aircraft carriers and a permanent presence in the Indo. That's not where we're going. I
Right.
think we see opportunity in other areas in preempting a conflict, readying ourselves for it, increasing our toolkit to deal with gray zone challenges, economic cooperation, trade, tech, you name it. But I wouldn't go so far to suggest there will soon be a world where European navies are going to be partnering with us to protect our friends in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, that I just want to make sure that point is clear.
Great. And that's right.
Yeah, just to add to Julie's point, I mean, I think fundamentally most of what we're talking about in this piece really falls under the category of deterrence. Um, and this piece is not fundamentally a piece about how, Europe and Asia are going to come together and, fight a conflict together. We will leave that to our friends in the Pentagon who have these jobs. But I think saying and making the argument that, look, if when Asian allies come to the Pentagon and we talk to them about what matters in the world and what we ought to be thinking about, and if we don't even talk about Europe or what's going on in Ukraine, or when the UK comes in, if we don't talk about Taiwan or what's going on in the South China Sea, that sends a signal to those partners that says there's nothing actually that we need from you
Well,
here.
don't
And
don't
and that's
misunderstand
not
what
true.
I'm. Yeah, don't
No,
misunderstand
I know
this.
you're not
Yeah,
saying that, Jim. Yeah, but I think most of what we're talking about is like essentially left of boom, where probably most of us would argue if you're really looking at what right of boom looks like, we ought to spend more of our time focusing on what we can do in the deterrence space.
Right.
I mean, it's such I mean, it really is an important part. And I guess I want to like ask you, and this is going to be hard, but like the counter argument. I mean, as you all rightfully noted in your piece, it's not really happening with this administration. A lot of the groundwork that you all laid to try to do this, I mean, it makes so much sense. If in a world in which our adversaries are increasingly cooperating and coordinating, we should be doing the same amongst our network of alliances. It seems, at least to, I know us here, an obvious point, but it's not happening like it was. And all of the good work and the momentum that you guys created seems to be tapering out. And I wonder why you think that is. I mean, like, again, like trying to put yourselves to make the best counter argument. Like if we were able to sit down and talk to a Bridge or, a Hegseth, and when he made these comments at Shangri-La and other places, what do you think is the rationale or the logic that's driving this? Or I don't, to the extent that we can, hypothesize about it.
I don't want to obviously can't speak for them on this.
No.
But what I would say,
It's also useful for listeners who are trying to understand like some of the drivers and motivations behind current administration actions. I know it doesn't make sense to us all the time, but to the extent that we can understand it, what do you think motivates it?
what I would say is, I think that there is an instinct, which in some ways I agree with. And Jim, it frankly gets to what you were just saying, that there is a concern that, like, hey, Europe, like, we just looked at what has been happening in Ukraine, and in Europe, you need to get way more serious about your own defense. And so we want you to laser focus on what you need to do to actually prepare for European contingencies and handling those in a more effective way. And hey, Asian allies, we want you to be way more serious about what a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific could look like and how you need to be prepared for that. And you know what? I agree with that statement. I don't disagree with that at all. I guess the point that Julie and I are making is, we think, and I would argue during the last administration, we thought that too. We talked to allies about that, but it didn't mean that it stopped there. And we didn't say, well, there's absolutely nothing for you to do that would be relevant or important when it comes to collaborating across theaters. And that's kind of the point that we're trying to make is, yes, we should really be hammering allies about what they need to do to be serious about their own self-defense in their own regions. But let's not also ignore the important ways that they could be doing more together across regions and the need for that because of what we're seeing our adversaries do.
And we would agree with that. I think we both agree with that.
Yeah, and in some ways, look, the genie is out of the bottle. So, I mean, yes, Europe is going to spend a lot more money now, based on what was decided at the NATO summit this summer. They're all, in theory, I hope in reality, going to get to 5% of GDP. And that's a good thing. And I agree with that and I applaud it. And we should all support that. And that's absolutely right. The capability shortfalls in Europe are acute. They've been acute for decades, but they're really, it's blinking red because of, in many ways, the generous support that was offered to Ukraine. So yes, Europe 100% has to focus on spending more on defense and building out more capacity. But as it does that, there's some interesting things that are happening. Poland, impatient with the delay in the delivery of US kit, is now turning to South Korea. And so if you travel to Warsaw or you go to, as I did, a live fire exercise in Poland, you may find yourself, this happened to me in 2023, standing next to 3 South Korean generals watching the live fire exercise together. And so I think, yes, they can continue to invest in building out their capabilities, but in some cases, they're pursuing these relationships either in the defense realm or well outside of it again, in the area of trade, economics, deepening those tech partnerships, connectivity, working with countries like India or South Korea or Japan, Australia, etc. So I'm not exactly sure it's really a zero sum, and I'm not exactly sure you can put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, and I think where Lindsey and I landed in the piece is you can do both things, or you can stress both things. Europe, for example, and Asia too, they need to invest more in defense, but they also need to broaden their partnerships and relationships with friends in the Indo-Pacific to be able to compete with what Russia and China are throwing at us.
But
Yeah,
the
I think that
question,
yeah, but that's like I think that's perfectly well summarized. To me, like kind of where the Trump administration is like it's separating the two regions and telling them you both need to focus like lasers on your problems at hand. I think this is just a yes and. While you're doing that, there also should be more connectivity for resilience,
Exactly.
deterrence, et cetera. So to me that, yeah, I think that
I
makes
guess, but the question I think Andrea was also asking, correct me if I'm wrong, as I'm sure you will, Andrea, but just getting your views on why. I mean, it's such common sense. I mean, everything you said, I don't. There's no one here arguing on that. It's very common sense, but it is so common sense. The question is, so why is this administration not doing it? And have they? Is it a Biden thing, so therefore it's bad and they're not going to do it, or they just don't realize this is something they should be doing because they're so thin on the staff level, no one has suggested. I mean, and any idea on what their argument might be not to do it? And I guess that y'all really didn't understand it either.
I mean, again, it's hard to know exactly where the full administration is. We've gotten bits and pieces of reporting from a couple of incidents and some messages sent to a handful of allies, either across the Pacific or the Atlantic. So, again, I think it's important for us to wait to read that national defense strategy when it comes out and take a long, hard look at it to see if there's any emphasis there. I will say, though, that perhaps we come back to where we started, and that is the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine did provide us all with a real time example of the importance of having our Indo-Pacific allies join our friends in Europe to support Ukraine with the necessary economic, humanitarian, and military assistance that was needed. And perhaps, I'm just guessing, because this administration is not leading that effort and not driving the assistance. I mean, it has launched Pearl at NATO, which is a program that allows European countries to buy American kit to send to Ukraine. But because the US is not leading the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, it is no longer providing military assistance, security assistance to Ukraine. Perhaps we've lost one of the best examples, and it did allow us in real time to see the fruits of this type of kind of trans-regional cooperation to help our friends in need in Ukraine. And so maybe that is taking away that useful real-time example and taking down, the temperature on the importance of this trans-regional cooperation. Again, it's just really hard to know, and I think it's a bit unfair to make kind of broad arguments here about where they're going to land, because we need to hear more from them, both in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, to really pass judgment on whether or not they're going to commit to it. The last thing I'll say is Lindsey and I, in our research, we did go back and look at, say, the first statement that President Trump made when he met his Japanese counterpart. And you'll note, unlike prior meetings between President Biden and his Japanese counterpart, there was no mention of our work together in Ukraine, the importance of preserving Ukraine's sovereignty and its right to exist. And those are interesting cues to pick up on. Again, we'll know how it all will be woven together once we see these strategies, but we did find that interesting.
Yeah,
The one little teeny thing I would add, I think Julie, what you said, I agree with. They're also, to me, like what I've picked up on is kind of just skepticism amongst many in this administration of the interlinkages between regions, that what you do in one region really has any bearing on the other. So I don't think that many in this administration buy into the argument that if we can defeat Russia, send a message that it somehow adds deterrence vis-a-vis China. So I think they just don't necessarily really buy into the interlinkages the same way, or they might say that actually to really increase deterrence, we need to do far less in Ukraine and put all of our resources, and that's the more credible deterrent. So I think and again, I would disagree with that. I think we all generally on here disagree with that to a large extent. So it is kind of I think just a different view on the blurring of the lines that we've talked about. So anyway, but I think, Lizzie, do you want to add one thing?
I was just going to say the other point that Julie made, and sort of like what you're missing because you don't do that, is our allies are actually accelerating their cooperation. They are doing it anyways, and in some cases, the dirty little secret is they're actually doing it because of us, because they're less sure about us and our own reliability. And we are, I think, missing an opportunity to shape where that cooperation goes. And they will continue to lean in, but maybe they won't cooperate in the ways or the places that actually serve U.S. interests, how we might like. We talk in the piece about, in some spaces, especially economically, they could actually work more closely together to push back on things that we are doing. And I think most concerning, as Julie mentioned in the Ukraine situation, the US harnessed the power of allied cooperation, and it would not have happened in the same way had we not been leading and pushing folks to work more closely together. And so the real concern is allies are going to do stuff together, but maybe it doesn't actually add up to what we need it to counter China and Russia if we aren't at the table helping to push and helping to shape it. And that's potentially the moment that we're missing.
Well, this was really wonderful. Excellent piece. I hope people will go back and read it if they haven't. But this was a really rich discussion, and thank you for joining us. And we'll look forward to continuing this. I mean, Lindsey, I think one of your earlier points was just so important with this growing cooperation amongst adversaries. It's changing a lot of dynamics, like you said, about the nature of conflict, where it happens, how long it happens. And I think we, amongst our group of allies, really need to better understand that. And once we kind of do that analytic work, it'll help drive and help us understand how we need to be working together. So I think that's a really important point. And looking forward to your continued thought leadership on where we need to go with our networks of alliances. So thanks to you both.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. And yeah, a lot of important points that I think think tanks can take a hold of and help flesh out and take forward in terms of the cooperation that needs to be done and is maybe fallow now. So
thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.